I'm looking at the French Suite in number 5, BWV 816, G major, and as I come back to it, and I'm always, when a student is working on it, I'm coming back to it again to examine it more deeply. I see now the three voices for most of the piece, but then sometimes he pulls back to two voices where the counterpoint is more obvious, where you have the upper voice and then a contrapuntal left hand. But especially with the three voices, you have lots of overlapping dissonances between the voices. You have sevenths going to sixths inside the texture, which suggests leaning on the dissonance and then resolving. You have to be carrying over notes with ties, which makes it very tricky. It's easy to forget the ties, and if you forget the ties, you're going to elude some of these important passing dissonances, which so characteristic of Bach, makes it so beautiful. So I'm going to start playing it. I'm going to put everything together, even though when I first learned it, I did the top voice, I did the bass stem down, I did them together. Then I said, what's the inner voice? By playing the two outer voices, I then could hear the difference of what the inner voice was. It's a little hard to piece out the inner voice because sometimes it's high up in the alto and then sometimes it's in a tenor range. And also sometimes the middle voice goes across from one hand to the other. So that's where it can get tricky. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just flesh out what is some of the dissonances, what are the passing tones, what are the sequences suggesting intensification when they go up, what are the sequences going down, what are the places where even when there's sequences there's intensification going down. Some interesting places in this, and I rationalized why that was, even though intuitively I felt it, but I was able to justify why when I went down with sequences that I intensified. Okay, so in the beginning you want to get this ta-da, ta-da, ta-da. It's so important that this doesn't do that, because indeed he has a quick note, 16th, going to a dotted 8th. So right away, ta-da, inner voice here, inner voice. Look, it formed a little choir effect there. A very important place, because I had to hold down some voices through 16th notes, but they were under voices, so I didn't want them to interrupt or be confused with the upper voice. I'm going to do that part a little slower where he does this. This was the upper voice, and this was the inner voice. So you have to be careful that you don't do things like that. And that's very tricky because you have to moderate your arm weight into your hands for various, fingers that you're playing, you're channeling, arm weight. But of course you're thinking across, and you're thinking in groups of notes. So that's another thing, grouping the notes. And again, when you have common tones, I tend to lean toward the moving notes of a common tone combination, such as da, to know when to hold notes and not to overhold notes either, because this is a tricky spot here, because he holds this over in the left hand, creates like that choir effect, and then he holds this over, and then he continues. Now over here in the left hand he has 7th dissolving to a 6th, which becomes a dominant of G major. So you have to have enough pressure on that G. left G, you're not going to hear the suspension because the suspension is against this resolution. So you have something to pull back to in that resolution. And it has to do with, again, channeling weight into these various combinations of notes. And again, you're always thinking in groups. Resolve. Now the sequence higher. And it falls back down. Now what I do here, you heard two sequences of one sequence of what I played first and then a sequence. What I do here is I have a lot of common tones again, so I go you want to avoid this. Really be careful of that, because if you blocked it, you hear what's coming out. And that helps too, little blocks. When you see these suggested places where it's thirds, fourths, fifths, things like that, thirds, fourths, fifths. If you blocked it, you can hear what's moving, and you want to try to flesh out the moving notes over the redundant common tones. It also, by having the common tones, it gives you that harmonic flavor, because it's giving you, if you block it, you'll hear it. That's what he wants to do, but it lags because they're broken chords, broken intervals. So what I do here in terms of the left hand, I do something interesting. On the left hand under that, I go separate, connect, and slur, kind of imitating. See, that's something in the left hand that I'm doing, because there's a lot of eighth notes against 16ths, and the 16ths are doing legato. To get the Baroque flavor, I'm just setting off some of the left-hand notes, and sequentially, I'm imitating what I do here. Kind of T, almost. A little bit modified, but you could hear that it's related. And then when I do it together, I'm hearing the melody. To do the right hand legato through that, however. So I get this. For the first one, I will do a little bit more. Now as I continue, what's very interesting is the right hand is kind of coming down, but it's coming down with common tones and the inner voice going down, but expanding the intervals if I block it. Thirds, fourths, fifths, sixths, sevenths, which suggests to me intensification in conjunction with the left hand as well, because we have that choir effect again. Just going to fall into that. So there again is your seventh going to a sixth, but this tells me to intensify, but not having the redundant common tones jump out, but having the moving notes. And then everything opens up to the cadence. Meanwhile, the left hand is going down. You have to hold this through, give us the choir effect again, the chordal effect, I'd say. You have to be aware of what is the left hand doing, what is the right hand doing, how am I going to voice. This presents a voicing challenge, this piece, there's no doubt. So I'm going to go back here. I'm going to start less, and then I'm going to do a crescendo. Open it up. That takes a lot of work. The left hand is going down with the right hand and creating, again, the broken chordal effect. It's still chordal in a sense. Now here, it's interesting, he finally has that cadence in D major, which is the dominant of G major, and he has these parallel thirds. So he has it's a little bridge, because now what we have, continuing sequence, this I would do less, the sequence. But guess what's coming? The opposite direction from this. Now we're going surprise, D minor. So this is just a crescendo here. But surprise. Here's that chordal effect. Tied notes over. Be so careful how you voice that, because really you want to go at the cadence point and then at the end. If they know how to push into certain notes that survive that root of that D major chord there, that survives all the way across as you're tying other components of D major. The fifth, the third, the root, so that you get the balance at the end that you want. Now, I do something interesting. Now we're hearing two voices a lot. Some intervals of two voices here. This is two voices, even though we have all this. So this is what I do in the left hand. And I might bring that out if I play this over on the repeat in this, second time. There's a repeat on this whole first A section. The first time I'll bring out the right hand, but I will make sure everybody knows that the surprise is the D minor. That's a big surprise. And what I do is I dip it. I do a crescendo to that, but I dip the F. So I'm doing. Now I go forward. Answer. You can see what I did there. Now you can continue this work. Again, I would first do the top voice, and then we do the bottom, then I'd see what's in the middle. Now we think he's going to be in D major, and it does start in the binary. You usually go to the dominant, but he keeps putting sevenths in and bringing us for a moment back to G, then he puts a D sharp and a B, and it brings us to E minor. You have to be aware of all these different modulations, and they happen so quickly. But you still have the basic idea of ta-da as the beginning. Ta-da, ta-da, ta-da. Inner voice, E minor. And sequences, left hand, both hands. So I brought them down because this is very conspicuous because you have the two voices. You don't have as much of a chordal effect here, or you're tying over notes. There's no tied over notes here, but you do hear this gorgeous da, D, G major, and E minor, and we think C, but there's going to be chromatics, which takes that away. Back to G major. I love that chromatic line, and that's something that you saw how I decided to phrase it. I specifically phrased it that way. So we make these decisions as I go along. But chromatic is totally beautiful. And on top of it, of course, are stacked sequences. And I'm going toward these appoggiaturas, you notice. Then he just lets it go. Inner voice. cadence. So you can see that's very important, that he stacked those sequences on top of that chromatic line, which is so gorgeous. And of course he got himself to E minor, and then a little bridge. See, that's D7, bring us to G major. But another 7th on the G chord brings us to C major for a moment. It's going higher. That's where you do your crescendo. So it's accelerating in the note values and doing, you know, scale higher and higher. Here's that surprise. I'm just giving you a little glimpse of what's going on here, and I could lecture for hours and hours on this, but you get the idea that you've got to know that your middle voice can't run into your top voice or run into your bottom voice. There are certain suspensions you have to be perking your ear up to, that you're having sequences that are getting intensified, but then you might have places where your sequence is going down because they're enlarging intervals with common tones that suggest intensification and not de-intensification. So I hope this was helpful. Now with the trills, you can eventually just let them go, but start measuring the trills. Eventually when you let them go, don't let them get too squeezed and tight. That's hard to do. It's your wrist. Anyway, it's very cold and it's very late, so I'm not quite very good at trills at this time of evening. It's almost midnight, believe it or not. So I hope this was helpful, and I'm trying my new computer. I'm trying to use it instead of my old iMac, because my iMac was having a lot of distortion when I replayed my tutorials. I wasn't sure what was going on, so I plugged in my Yeti mic into my Mac Air. I'm going to see what the result is. That's why I'm not going to do any editing. I'm just going to go right off now here.